Hello, everyone,
Hi.
and welcome to the latest VOCES8 live from home. You're in my home. I'm Jonny Pacey. I'm the bass in the group, and you're in my home in southeast London. And next to me is the lovely Georgia, who is going to. Some of the stuff that I'm going through today is some of the more niche, you might call it geeky, aspects of music. And so George is going to be here as a sort of control group, so that if there's anything that I've skipped over that should be blindingly obvious to me, but maybe not to people who haven't spent years looking at old bits of paper, then she can ask those questions on all your behalf. And she's also going to monitor everything that you say, so that I can answer any questions that you might have that she hasn't thought of. So hello, Georgia, and thank you for that.
You're so welcome.
Well, we're going to dive right in, and basically what I'm talking about today is how to turn what's on the left into what's on the right. So those of you who are familiar with this sort of stuff will know that what's on the left there is a part book, and this particular part book is one by from the very end of the 16th century, 1575, and it's a piece by Thomas Tallis. And part of my job with VOCES8 is to make all of the sheet music that we sing from. So we don't just learn everything that we do by ear. We have bits of paper, and they have lots of dots and lines and that sort of thing on them. And it's my job to make sure that everyone's got the right notes, at least in front of them. And then it's their job to make sure they sing them right. And in the olden times, which is my sort of specialist period, they wouldn't have scores like we do now. They had books. Each person would have a book with his own part in it, and you couldn't see any of the other parts. Now, this was fine at the time, and actually, as we'll see later, it was a lot more economical for them. But these days, we like, as choirs, to see all of the parts that are going along at the same time. And so, as I said, my job is basically to turn what was the old style of part books into the modern choral scores. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that. Some of it's going to go into quite a lot of depth that you may or may not be totally interested in, but I hope that there'll be something in there for everybody. So let's dive right in and talk about what is my role as an editor. Well, basically, my job is to relay what the composer intended for his performers to see, but because of the modern notational style being very different from the old notational style, I want to present it in a way that is familiar and readable for a reader of modern notation. And there's various different influences on this, apart from the editor. There's the composer himself. It's almost invariably a him back in the 16th and 17th centuries. There's his copyist, the person who takes his music from the draft and writes it all out in its fine copy for the singers to read. And then slightly later in this period, there are the printers who take the handwritten copy and rack it all up with lots of metal type on a printing press, and then cover it with ink and then put the paper on. And so that has its own sort of interesting things and also problems. And there's quite a large difference between the scores of the 17th century and today's. I'll show you actually now what we're going to be looking at. And this is a score from the early 17th century that we'll be looking at in a bit more detail later on. But you can see this looks very different to a modern score in a number of ways, and I'll talk about how that is and what we do to overcome that. So some of the differences: clefs, tactus. Tactus is the beat that goes through a piece, and in the 17th century and around this sort of period, the concept of the beat is quite different to what it is now, and I'll go into that a bit later on as well. And also the expectation of the experience of the singers and their familiarity with their liturgy and with the style of music. And also there's a huge difference in the concept of a key, which exists in a very different way in the 17th century, and I'll go into that as well. We're basically going to be going through the 5 steps that I do when I'm taking a piece of music from its first sources through the copying out of the music, through reconstructing any missing parts that there might be, adding the text. By that I mean the underlay, so the lyrics that go along the bottom of each part, and then how to present it all nicely and legibly as well. What I'm not going to be talking about today, but I think I might cover, depending on how long this lockdown goes, might cover in future videos, a more general history of music notation. In these 3 examples, you can see a big difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. This goes in chronological order. On the left-hand side is a piece from the 13th century, which is a piece that's now in Florence, but it's of a book of repertory from the Notre Dame school in Paris. So this is one of the earliest pieces of written down polyphony. And then this goes through the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, and then in the 17th century on the right, which is a piece from the Triumph of Oriana, which is a manuscript from the 17th century. I'm also not going to be looking too closely at the actual manuscripts themselves. There's, again, a whole lecture that could go on about manuscript studies, but including talking about the paper, which can get really, really geeky, how they're bound, in what sort of enclosures they're bound, and then anything that libraries and collections have done to restore them later on. We might talk about that later if there's a lot of interest in the future, but not today, because today we're talking about a case study of a piece called Angelus ad Pastores Ait by Hieronymus Praetorius. This is a piece that was written at the turn of the 17th century, but it appears here in a source of lots of different music by lots of different composers, which was compiled by a chap called Erhard Bodenschatz in the beginning of the 17th century. This particular manuscript is kept in a library in Dresden, but they've digitized it, so they've basically taken high-resolution photographs of all the pages, and then put them online, so that people like me can go and have a look and make up new copies from that. So, as I was saying, we got 5 stages that we're going through when we're making this edition. We want to collect all of the sources that we can find, that either in libraries or online, and I'll go into that in a moment, and also plan out this edition, how it's going to work on the page. We're going to transcribe all of the notes, so that's taking the notes from the old page, putting them into our notation software, reconstructing any missing parts, and also correcting any mistakes, adding the text, so adding the underlay and any other bits of text that we need to, and then making it all look pretty.
The most important bit.
The most important bit, I think so. So, first things first, we've got to gather our source material together. Well, how do we do that? There's a number of different options. Of course, you can go to libraries and email or ring up private collections and museums and go in and look at the actual original things. There's loads of stuff in national libraries. There's masses of the British Library, so you'll often see me there on a VOCES8 down day, poring over some 16th century. Anyway, and you can go and physically look at them and leaf through them, and most places will allow you to go and see all but the rarest and most fragile. But increasingly these days, there is a move by libraries and by museums to put their material online in a digital form, and that can be done. That can be found on their websites. So just look at the libraries that have these collections and see if they've digitized those manuscripts. And often, if they're not online, then if you just email them, they will. They might have digitized them, but just not put them online yet. So it's worth having a conversation with their librarians. And there's also loads of open source material. Places like IMSLP, CPDL, all of those places have digitized scans of older music. So go and have a look at those as well. So once we've got our materials, then we've got to plan out how we're going to put this edition together. Now, as I showed you before, in the where is it? There it is. In the source, there's a huge amount of information on this page, more so than you get in most modern editions, anyway. And you can see at the top here, that line of text right at the top has a number of different things in it. It's got the page number on the far left, the number of the piece, which isn't the one in Roman numerals there. So this is piece number 52 in this collection. It's got the composer, because this collection is full of lots of different composers. Hieronymus Pretorius has a number of pieces in this collection, but he didn't write all of them by any means. So they've got the composer at the top there, and then the number of voices that this piece uses. It's quite obscured here, but that actually says 8 vocum, 8 voices. And then finally on the right of that line, it shows you what part you're looking at. In this case, Discantus 1, which Discantus is an old name, meaning sort of higher voice. Not quite the superior, it's not quite the top voice, but a higher voice. So this is probably going to be our soprano 1 part. So once we've discovered how many voices this is, how many staves we're likely to be using, we then have a look at the range. This is, by that I mean the distance from the lowest note to the highest note of a particular part. So let's have a look at this second example down here. Next to the big P, big florid P, there's just sort of half shaded away, there's those 2 boxes with lines drawn in between them. That is an old C clef, and that means that staff line, so that bottom line of this staff, is a middle C. And then you count up from everything up from there as to what notes you're going to get. So for example, in this extract, the first note in this part is a G. And you can see there that we have 1 flat in this key signature, which is right next to the clef, and that's going to be a B flat. But next to the flat is the C with a line through it. That's a time signature, so that means that we're in half common time, and then a load of rests. Are there any questions at this point?
Does half common time mean 2/4?
Yes. It means that this piece is in duple meter.
Okay.
So it means that there's each beat is divided up into 2. There's a whole other video in
okay, well we won't get into that.
In what's called mensuration, and that's but yes, we'll get up into that in another time. But suffice it to say that this at the moment means that we're in duple meter, so we have 2 beats, 2 internal beats for each beat. And then we have a look at the note values. I'm going to go back to the source here, and you can see through here that most of these notes are void. They're not filled in. So most of them are minims or half notes if you're across the pond, or semibreves or whole notes. And this is what the singers at the time, were used to reading. They were used to reading music that was grouped in minims, in half notes. These days, we're more used to reading things that are grouped in crotchets or quarter notes, which are the filled-in ones with stems. And as a result, I tend, with this sort of music, to halve all of the note values. So every minim is going to end up being a crotchet, every crotchet is going to end up being a quaver, and so on. And that just makes it slightly more legible for people who might be reading this piece in one moment and then a piece of contemporary music in the next moment. It just evens everything out, so they haven't got to think about things about counting the wrong sort of beats. Back we go to the keynote. So I've decided we're gonna halve the note values here. We also have to see if there's any change in the meter. Sometimes there will be, sometimes there won't be. In this instance, there is, and we go from a duple meter in the first part, and for most of this second part here. But you'll see here in the middle of the screen that, oh, I'm going past it. There we are. In the middle of the screen, on the second line down, there is about a third of the way through, there's a big circle with a line through it. So that means that we're changing mensuration. You can look up mensuration if you like, and get more info on that. I won't do that here, but it's a big topic. And after that, there is a 3 and a 2. That means that we're going into a passage of triple time. And so each of those larger beats is now grouped into groups of 3. And these filled in semibreves that you see here mean something different, and it's called coloration. We'll get onto that in a moment. Okay. So we're planning on there being a change of meter at some point, and is there a transposition? By this I mean does the clef change from line to line, so that you just got to be aware that that you might be having to read slightly different lines when you're transcribing. In this instance, I've already had a look through, and there isn't any, so we are all safe on that score. Okay, next, part 2, transcription. This is the drudge work of the thing, but it's really, really important that it's done right. So you've got a number of you can collect together a number of sources. In this instance, I'm actually going to just use the one source. There are other sources of this piece out there, but for reasons that will become apparent in a moment, I'm just choosing to use this one source. But if you have more than one source, you want to choose from those a primary source, and that's the one that you're basically going to copy down from first. What sort of features would you use to choose a primary source? Well, most complete is probably the highest up there. The source that has the fewest number of omissions in it, and also is then the most legible as well, so that you can see exactly what the composer or the copyist of that particular manuscript wrote, and also the manuscript that is closest in provenance to the composer. So if, for example, you had a piece that was in the composer's own hand, or you had a piece that was printed a few decades later, then obviously the more authoritative source is going to be the one from the composer. Even if it's slightly less legible, it being closer to the composer makes it a more important source. And you can use the other source as a sort of check on that to see if maybe there are any revisions or any mistakes that crept in. After you've chosen your primary source, then you copy out all the notes completely unadorned. So even if you're convinced that something is going to turn out to be a mistake later down the line, copy it down faithfully, and then we'll see later on how you deal with those situations.
Question.
Yes.
Where are you copying it into? Also, can you repeat that question for the lovely people who might not be able to hear my voice?
Yes. The question was, where am I copying it into? And I can show you just that. So this is a program that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, called Sibelius, and this is the final copy of the edition that I've made of this piece. And basically, what I am doing is writing it into this line here, into this score here. So I'll have the PDF of the source maybe on a different screen to one side of me, and I'll go back and forth from one to the other, copying in. I've got a keyboard down here that I can play things in as well to make it slightly quicker.
Okay.
And so I'm copying things in like this, remembering to halve all the note values as I'm doing it, which is the thing that just takes a little bit of getting used to. Right. And then once you've copied down all of the primary source, then you'll go about going through the secondary sources and noting any discrepancies between them, any things that they don't agree on. And you want to then make a list, just on a piece of paper for your own use, of all the differences, and then you can work out which one of those to use later on. Then you look for mistakes. These mistakes could be on your own copying. I find even no matter how concentrated I'm working, I'll always make some silly error maybe putting in the wrong note value, and then everything's shifted off by a beat or something like that. So just going through and checking my own work for copying errors. But then also in the sources copyist, the printers, people who printed music on big presses of this time period, they weren't trained musicians, so they wouldn't know. For example, if we look at this example at the top of the slide here, that there, although you can't really, it's a bit sort of zoomed in to see the context of it, but that is an alto part, and it's a pretty clear cadence figure. It goes bum ba da da da, and you can see here that that the printer has merely racked up all his racks, and he's put one in upside down, because what this should be, the middle note that goes right down, should actually be the other way around. It should be on the second line from the top rather than the second line from the bottom, and the stem should be going down. So you can see there that he's just put in his little piece of type upside down. So what I realise I haven't explained what a printer does, have I?
Not really, no, but I'm getting it, so I feel like that's good.
Like in a book printing press, there are the printer will have a whole rack of thousands of little metal pieces, each of which has 5 lines and a little something else on it. So a note or an accidental. You can see those crosses on the top line of that example there. Those are sharp signs. They're very old sharp signs, but they're sharp signs.
I thought they were the mistakes that you were talking about.
Oh no,
so
they're not. No,
they're sharp signs.
They're old sharps. So each of those individual, you can see where the line is, the stave lines are broken. That's because each individual point has a different piece of metal that's all racked up on a galley, is what they call it. They put loads of ink over it and then put the piece of paper on top, press it down, and then you get this nice incorrect piece of music. So it's obvious here he just turned the type the wrong way up, but that's pretty easy to correct. It is always very important that we're going to note where this mistake was. So in my transcription below that example, you can see the little number 2 above the E, the semiquaver E, and that will be connected to a footnote, which just says that that the source has this as the wrong note, and tell them what that note was. And then, there's a really fun example at the bottom here of a horrible bit of attempted correction gone wrong. You can see that this is a tenor 2 part, and we're looking at, if you look on the right, the first time the word mundi comes along, that minim and that crotchet there, well, that's all contained within that splodge on the left in the middle of the example. Someone had obviously thought that the what is the minim in the source was wrong and tried to correct it, but he corrected the wrong note and actually made it worse. And so he's filled in the note that's supposed to be empty, supposed to be an empty minim, and then realised his mistake and then gone and tried to add another note before on the wrong line. So he hasn't done a very good job there. So that took a little bit of working out. But in the end, you can see the footnote that I put at the bottom of my example there just says that this note is missing and leaves it at that. Next, ficta. Now this is a whole other video in itself. Okay. Ficta. It's a bit of the dark arts of early music. Suffice it to say that in this instance, things are fairly obvious if you know what you're looking for. I'll do other things on ficta later, I think, but purely for editorial purposes, we want to demonstrate that anything that we're putting in the staff of our edition is what was originally written, and anything that we're going to add as editors, then we put above the staff. So in this instance, you can see those 2 little accidentals that I've put above the notes. C, I think this is discounted. So C sharp and B natural. Those are editorial, and I've done that by putting the accidentals above the staff. And again, this is just a cadence figure, so it's pretty obvious that it would be it would be those alterations. I would like to tell you why, but it'll go into a whole other conversation.
Let's not do that.
Let's not do that now.
Let's not do that.
No. I'm already 25 minutes in, so
It's fine.
I'm only on section 2.
It's going to be great. Keep going.
Thank you. And then cautionary accidentals. Well, we want to basically make it as easy as possible for the singers to read their parts accurately and at the first time. So if you look at this example that I've got on the right hand side here, let's remember that we have one flat in our key signature, and so this is a D major chord on that minimum of an enunciation, with an F sharp in it in the alto part. Now in the next bar, very soon after that F sharp, there's an F natural. Now the bar line means that the F is definitely going to be natural. However, because there's been an F sharp in the alto part so recently, and nothing else has suggested that we might be changing the key center, then it would be quite easy for the alto to accidentally sing a sharp F when they mean to sing a natural F. So I've just put a little natural sign in parentheses above the stuff, just as a helpful reminder to the altos that actually that's still a natural, and it is definitely a natural. It's not supposed to be a sharp. So just beware. And the same thing in the bass part. They will have heard the alto sing an F sharp in that D major chord, and then might be tempted to sing their F in the next bar as a sharp, especially because the F is only corrected to natural in the alto part just a quaver earlier. So it's just a reminder to the basses that they're still singing naturals, and this doesn't need to be used very much. It's only in quite limited circumstances, but this is a good example of that. Other editorial markings we might add, and this is something that isn't done by everyone but should be. This is ligatures. This is where notes are physically joined together. So you'll see in this example on the top left, those two boxy notes at the end of the example, you can't really see because the printer ink hasn't quite gone through the whole way. But those are supposed to be joined from the bottom right corner of the top one to the top left corner of the bottom one. There should be a little line between the two. Do you see that?
I do see that. Yeah.
Yeah, it hasn't come through very well, but they're supposed to be joined, and
that's the ligature.
That's called the ligature. Those
Right.
notes are in ligature. What that means in practice is that you're not supposed to change syllable during those two notes. So,
I didn't know that.
so if you look on the right hand side in the example, you could have, for example, you could go Annuncio vobis, but the fact that those last two notes are in ligature prohibits that from happening. And to show that that's what we've done, and why we then have done the text as it is, put a little bracket over the top, and then no one has any questions about that. And then I said earlier that we were looking at a change in meter in the middle of the second part. Well, that's what we get here, and this is called coloration. So this is where the notes are the same, but they are coloured in, and that means that they have a different value. So rather than each beat being da, 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 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, it ends up being 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And those notes being filled in just show that. There are lots of rules behind this, but
Question.
yes.
So the notes that are filled in,
Yeah.
they are semi-breves
The
or whole notes?
The diamond ones are semi-breves, yeah, and the square ones are breves.
Okay.
But they're just filled in.
But they're filled in,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah,
denotes a difference in...
exactly.
Right, okay.
And in this instance, then I've gone for the decision of making my notes a quarter of the length rather than a half of the length,
Okay.
just to make it absolutely even across the whole edition. The original singers, reading this music, would have known that that's what they're supposed to do because they were brought up doing that. But we don't have that same sort of specific training, so I just make it really easy for the modern singers to see it.
Nice.
And then finally, I think in this section, bar lines. You'll notice that that in this whole extract, there are no bar lines whatsoever, apart from the very end. This is very common. They didn't use bar lines particularly. Sometimes you can find them, but it's quite rare, and certainly not in printed or church music at the time. And so we're going to have to add bar lines because that's what we're used to seeing. And there are two ways to go about bar lines in terms of how you treat them with respect to modern notation. You could do what a lot of early music specialist publishers do, which looks lovely. Is keep all of the notes as they were in the original, and by that I mean not splitting them over bar lines. So if you look at the second into the third bar of my example there, those tied quavers over the bar line there actually correspond to the minim that's in the source above the letter A on the left hand side there. Can you see that?
Above the letter
above
A?
the letter A, just there.
Yes.
So that minim turns into a crotchet in our edition, and because that crotchet is over the bar line, then we choose either to remove the bar line and just put the bar lines outside the staff, or do what I've done and tie the note over the bar line. So split it up and tie it over the bar line.
Two questions.
Yes.
One from me, one from Alan.
Okay.
How do you put the bar line outside of the staff?
There is... Oh, you're testing me now, Alan.
No, that's actually
from
my
you.
question. Alan's question is
I
a lot more.
I believe it's in notations between staves. There we are.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I see. Okay. Right, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then
Alan asks,
yes.
For this piece, would VOCES8 use the just tuning system or the equal tuning system as discussed yesterday by the lovely Blake Morgan?
That is a very good question.
Excellent question, Alan.
Yeah, and Blake did really go into a lot of very interesting detail on that one. We would probably more often than not use just when it comes to this piece. We tend to use equal, although Blake's going to shout at me when he sees this. We tend to use equal pretty much only for jazz repertoire, and we tend to use just more when it comes to this sort of repertoire. You could really go down the whole rabbit warren and start talking about mean tone and all those sorts of things. It's not really specifically my area, but I think we'd probably tune things justly in this piece. Good. So we've done bar lines, I think, and then we get on to reconstruction. I'm going to skip over this quite quickly because we don't have that much time. But you'll notice that, well, you won't notice because I haven't told you. This source that I'm using here is almost complete, but not entirely complete. It's missing the bass 1 part. So if I just go... Oh no. Okay, so we go altus 2, tenor 1, tenor 2, bass 2. Uh-oh. There ain't no bass 1 part. And we know there's supposed to be a bass 1 part because it says 8 voices in the top. Luckily, we're not totally alone. We have a bassus generalis. What's a bassus generalis?
Yeah.
Bassus generalis is either a stringed instrument, but more likely a keyboard. And you can tell this is a keyboard part because if you look at the sort of bottom 2 lines of this, you'll see some of the notes have numbers over them, and that gives an indication to the player what harmony is going on above it. It's a sort of figured bass. So if you want to look that up, go and look up figured bass. But this gives us a clue as to basically what the lowest note at any particular time is. So that we're going to use this as a very helpful tool in reconstructing our bass 1 part. Yes.
Question. So the bassus generalis, if that's the lowest note at any given time, does that mean if the alto had the lowest note at a point in a bar, it would be the alto part, and then it would move to the bass
Yes,
2.
in fact, if you look at this opening here,
Yeah.
this starts in the sopranos. Sorry, in the altos. Is it the altos? I can't remember. That's the tenor, actually. There we are.
Oh.
So this opening here is the first 2 notes of the tenor.
Yeah.
Then you'll see the tenor 2 comes in. So then you get another tenor part.
Right, I'm with you.
And then an alto comes in. That's now the lowest part.
Okay.
And then we have the bass 2 part. And you can see the bass 2 part here comes in after 8 beats.
Okay.
But if you count the same number in the bassus generalis part, there's a bass clef here.
Yeah.
There's a bass clef
You found it.
just before the word Angelus starts.
So is
that's a note that doesn't appear in any of the other 7 parts, and it's also at the right sort of range for a bass 1.
So that's
so this is the opening to our bass 1 part.
Okay. All right.
So now if we apply the principles of imitation, you can see that every single part for the first 2 bars has the same figure going up, da, 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 da. And it makes sense then that the bass, which looks like it starts like this, would then carry on up that scale. And then basically once we've done all the bass 2 part, we can fill in the gaps where the bass 2 has rests with whatever's in the bassus generalis part.
Okay.
And so if you look at the end of bar 5 in my edition to the middle of bar 7, which is on the right hand side of the example, you can see that corresponds to the bottom line on the top left of the bassus generalis part.
The bass of your part, right? The bass line. Is that what you're saying?
The first bass part.
First bass part.
The first bass part
Got it.
at ad pastores are matches the ad pastores are of the bassus generalis part.
Okay.
So nice. What I do is I go through the whole piece, just filling in those gaps between the bass 2 and the bassus generalis. And then, once we've done that, we can fill in the missing parts using the context, using the principles of imitation, and other sources that we can find, and sometimes just doing basically a bit of composing. Now, I told you that I was only using this source, despite there being another one that is also available online. The other one that is available online is complete. It does have the other the bass 1 part in it, but I wanted to show you a bit about reconstruction, so I've ignored it for the time being. Sorry. But anyway, here's my bass 1 part, and actually it's largely similar to Pretorius's. Yeah.
Do you want to hear something funny?
Yes, I do.
So we have the speech to text thing.
Yeah.
Across every time you say bass 2 part. Thanks for this, Mark. By the way, it comes out as bass teapot, and it's the greatest. Thanks,
I
Mark.
think I should
brilliant.
have a bass teapot. Can someone send me a bass teapot?
Yes.
I'd love a bass teapot.
I think you deserve a bass teapot.
Thank
Absolutely. You. Right. Sorry. Please carry on.
Right, after that tea break,
Right.
part 4. We're getting into the meat of things. Text.
This is the fun bit.
This is the fun bit. You'll have noticed, I'm sure, that this piece is in Latin. And it's also a pretty common text. So it shouldn't be too much of a problem for us to find an authoritative version of this text for us to use in making our edition. There are a few things that need to be ironed out when transferring something from this sort of old manuscript into modern. And one of the first things is text modernization. So you'll see here at the beginning of the example that I've got there, the G, N, U, and then the U has a little line across the top.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the end of the word manium. And what the U with the line across the top means is that that's just a kind of universal symbol at the time that an M follows, and it will only appear on a U, sometimes an A. I can't think of many other examples of maybe I don't think it happens on I either, but certainly a lot on U. Just to save a bit of space, when things are quite packed in, they'll just put that line across the top of the U, so that you know that it ends up being manium rather than manu. and you can see that in my the first bar of my edition below. Other things, V's often actually are used. There's unfortunately no examples in this particular manuscript of that. It tends to be a slightly more English thing, I believe. But in this case, all of the V's are actually V's. Sometimes you'll have V's that are actually used. They sometimes look a little bit different to the real V's in the parts. But as I say, if you go and find the original text, it should be pretty obvious where those are. And then sometimes things that look like F's, if you look at the 1, 2, 3, 4th word in the source example, it looks like F'd. Well, that F looking thing is actually an S, so it should be Est. The reason that it's drawn like this is if you think about what I was talking about earlier about the printing process and people and the printers racking up the lines of metal pieces. Well, a T, if you think about it physically, a T is actually quite a thin piece of metal, so it's going to be quite bendy, and it might break. So what they do instead, to add some strength, is to put a little ligature onto the previous letter. So in this instance, the S just provides a bit of support to the T, and it becomes est like that, but it looks a little bit like an F. The same thing happens at Salvator. Obviously, this isn't in ligature with anything because it doesn't have anything to be in ligature with, because the A is quite short and quite strong by comparison, and the L's, poor them, are just going to have to survive for themselves because they don't have anything that they can be in ligature with either. Other things, hyphenation. Hyphenation is when you have a word, a polysyllabic word, like, for example, natus, the third word of this example. Natus is split over two separate syllables, na and tus. Now, in the source, they don't have that word split up. And even if they did, they wouldn't put anything in between them that you just sort of expected to know your Latin. But in my edition, for all of those words that are split up, I've put a little hyphen, and Sibelius does this automatically. You put a little bit of a hyphen in between to show that actually the word isn't finished yet, and that the word natus is discrete as itself, and it's not separately na and tus. And you can see that in the example, where this is also an example of a breve that's been split, semi-breve that's been split.
Whole note.
A whole note, yeah, that's been halved to a minim, or half note, and then split over a bar line. And you can see there that I split up the word na and tus and put a little hyphen in the middle as well.
Nice.
And finally, on this one, extender lines. These are what the lines that you get. I'll go to the previous example. These are the lines that you get at the end of a word or a single syllable that extend out across more than one note. So in bar 5, for example, in the soprano part, there's a number of notes that are on the same syllable. That's called a melisma. And that line at the bottom just shows you that ad is a word in itself, and that it should be sung across all of those notes. And that makes it really very clear for the performer.
Excellent.
Great.
We have... Oh, no, look, it's right here. Nathan, it's coming up. The answer to your question.
Ah, good.
Please go.
Was it about the idge?
Yes, it was about
it's
the idge.
It's about the idge. The idge is fun. So, to save ink was very expensive at the time. And to save ink, and time as well, printers and scribes often wouldn't write multiple copies of repeated words. And instead, to show that you were supposed to sing the same words again, they would write just this little IJ below. Now, more often than not, and particularly at this period, slightly later in the development of music printing, it's pretty they make it pretty obvious what the word setting should be. So you can see here in this example, the first two phrases are exactly the same in terms of note values, of rhythms. So you can see you get Annuncio vobis, and the second one is Annuncio vobis. Exactly the same, and that little IJ just shows you you're supposed to sing the same words again. It's the same rhythm. It's pretty straightforward. Now, even though this is blindingly obvious, still in our edition we have to show that anything that we've done is editorial and not included in the original source. And the way we do that with underlay and text is just to put it in italics. So you'll see in this in the example that I've given below, the opening Annuncio vobis is in Roman type, and then the second phrase is in italics because that I've added. And even though there is no other option, I still need to make it clear that this is something that I've added and not what Pretorius, not something that Pretorius originally wrote on the piece of paper. And that's true of any editorial marking that you make. You have to make it clear that you've made that you've put that on the piece of paper, even if it's really clear that that's what should happen. And finally, on text, placement and syllabification.
Good word, that.
Yeah, why does text always have the longest words? Anyway, if you look at the example I've given here, there's a number of different ways you could text this. You could have what I've done, Alleluia, or you could have Alleluia, or you could have any combination thereof in the middle. Now, fortunately, in this particular example, it seems pretty clear what the composer and what the printer want you to do. But sometimes it's less clear, and on these occasions, this is kind of where text editing becomes more an art rather than a science, and experience is king as well. So, singing and listening to a lot of early music, you'll know what composers like to do. So for example, that Tallis often will like to have his final syllables placed on the note before the final note, rather than on the final note, which Bird likes to do, for example. But it's just through knowing that and looking at other repertoire in other editions of the same composer, and that sort of thing. Write how you'd expect to read. So sing it to yourself as you're writing it. I often hum along things to myself when I'm writing them, just to see how I would naturally sing it, and something that seems unnatural I might wish to change. And then anything I change, I would then put in italics to make it clear that I had made that change. The Bible of music notation is a book called Behind Bars, which is published by Faber, and it's by the wonderful Elaine Gould. So and there's a whole chapter on exactly this in Latin and English, in other languages as well. So if you're interested in this, go and check out Elaine Gould's Behind Bars, and I'll come back to that at the end. Finally, the home stretch.
You're doing great.
We're on to beautification.
Beautification.
Layout and presentation. This is where we go from a humble bag of notes to a beautiful presentation score that singers can't fail to sing correctly the first time.
No, keep going.
Part of the informed singer's job is to research and know what they're singing, and you can really help that as an editor in a number of ways. The first and probably most important for music of this sort of style and period is the prefatory stave. As they say, a picture tells 1,000 words, and in this, what we're doing here is really showing the singer through a sort of picture what the source looks like and what their part has come from. And so you can see this opening Descantus soprano 1 part here. I've basically copied faithfully the clef, the key signature, the time signature, the first rest, and the first few notes in their original values.
Question.
Yes.
From me, not from the lovely people watching. So where does this go? This
Prefatory.
Prefatory.
This goes. I'll show you.
Sorry. Thanks.
That's all right. This goes at the beginning.
Oh, okay. So it's just like a reference point.
Exactly. So this it doesn't get sung. This is just a little picture of where this music has come from.
Right.
And so that the singers can see that originally their first note wasn't a dotted crotchet, a dotted quarter. Originally it was a dotted half.
Or a dotted minim.
Or dotted minim. But the editor has chosen to halve the note values in order to make it clear to them and make it more legible for them, make it more modern for them.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will see two things. The first is that there is no base 1 prefatory stave. That's because in this one I've made it up.
Hey.
And so there isn't a part book from which to copy. The even eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that I've actually slightly misaligned these examples, and that altus 2 shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be where it is. It should be up with with tenor 1. So sorry for that. They're in slightly the wrong order, but there we are. Worst things happen at sea.
Exactly.
And then working out how big your music's going to be, how large it's going to look on the page, and the unit we use to do that is the rastral size, the staff size, staff space, and the rastral size. And I'll show you what I mean. So if we look at the left-hand side here, we've got a rather large rastral size. And rastral size means the distance between the bottom staff line and the top staff line of each individual part.
Where's that come from?
The word rastral. Rastral, when music was being handwritten at this period, the scribes or the composers had a five sort of nib pen that they dip in their ink and then draw across the paper to draw staff lines. And they had lots of different sizes of them, and they're called rastrums. That's where that comes from.
Good to know.
So yeah, on the left we have a large rastral size. This is a piece of A4 at either side here, so the same size paper. But you can see that because we've got such a large size, there's masses of white space on this piece of paper, wasting huge amounts of paper, and you only get 2 bars on this sheet. That's going to mean that page turns, which are noisy, even no matter how quietly you try to do them, when you have 20 people doing them, they're noisy, happen more frequently, and that's a bad thing. So and on the right here, you can see we've got 12, 15 bars of music. We've got way more stuff on the page. We have 2 systems on this page rather than one. A system is in this instance it's 8 staffs, but it's the entire ensemble. The line for the entire ensemble is called a system. So we've got the top 8 lines of the system 1, the bottom 8 lines of system 2, and we managed to fit a lot more music on that size, on that piece of paper at that size. And it's really at this point a balancing act between the amount of paper you can conserve, which helps the environment, of course, but also helps people's arms when they're holding massive sheaths of paper. That's going to be less comfortable for them to sing in. Balancing that between them being able to see it and read it clearly, so it being large enough to be legible. So this is a real balancing act. The edition that I've made is possibly on the smaller side, but I think when you print it out on A4, it would just about be okay.
Nice. It looks very nice.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Your check's in the post. Then also we're trying to work out where is a sensible point for page turns. Page turns, as I said, are invariably, no matter how much you try, they're noisy. And so trying to get them at a point when most of the choir is singing and singing loudly, rather than when everyone's stopped and is quiet, that's the sort of the optimum. And also conservation of paper, as I've said. and then also trying to determine what is the best font in terms of typeface and of size. So in my example, I'm using a font here called Garamond, which I find nice and clear, and it's then also a pretty nice size as well. So this is Garamond, and it's 9 point. For the lyrics, I found that quite legible, but you can mess around with that and try. It's always if you can, better to see things physically. So if you can print out things when you get them in a decent shape and see them on the paper, rather than just seeing them on a computer screen, that's always going to help you as well. Getting towards the end here now, commentary. Now this is really important because it explains to the performer in layman's terms what you did. So you'll read. You can read here. It's quite a large paragraph. I'll just summarise it. That I've halved the note values, except when they're quarters, which is in that triple section we talked about earlier. All the bar lines I've put in. The underlay, the lyrics are all the ones that are in italics are mine. They're not original. That sort of thing. You're explaining about what your bracketing system means, because not everyone has the same one. You explain about the accidentals system. So if you're putting in accidentals that aren't in the original, explain where they go and why you've put them there. All that sort of thing. Basically explain in as brief but succinct way as possible what you did. And then finally, list your sources. One of the most frustrating things I find when I'm reading an edition of some old piece of music is when they don't list their sources, because there's countless times when as an informed performer you might think, oh, I'm not sure I'm not sure about that passage. I think that something might be wrong there, or something might be different, or that the composer might not have completely intended it to be like that. Well, you can go and check if the editor has listed their sources. You can go back to the original source and you can say, oh yeah, this is what the composer wanted me to see, and so I can then inform my performance based on that. And it's also a good sort of peer review system for editing as well. It's so always list your sources. And finally, if at all possible, add in at the bottom of the first or the last page, or on a title page or something like that, somewhere in the volume, add the text, and if it's not in the language of the singers, then put a translation for them as well. And if you can, put it in the original poetic form. So, for example, when we were setting the booklet for our new album, After Silence, I was doing some proofreading of it, and we've recorded a piece by Benjamin Britten called A Hymn to St Cecilia, and we had a bit of a conversation between a few of us about exactly how that poem was going to be written. Was it going to be put in the booklet as Britten wrote it, or as W.H. Auden originally had written it? So make sure that you have that conversation with yourself as well. And I think that brings us basically to the end of my spiel. I hope that was interesting. And
I found it very interesting.
Do go and read this book, Behind Bars. It's a big thing, but it's really as I said, the Bible of music notation. And I'm going to also upload and put in the comments or somewhere around this post a short bibliography if you want to check out some more things about the notation or the typesetting or anything to do with that. Then I'll put that up in the next few hours. Questions?
Excellent. Well, I wish that I had a big list for you, but you've kind of answered everything that came up. So very well prepared.
Thank you.
And very well asked, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your comments. This has been so much fun reading through them. But yeah, if you have any other questions, I'm assuming that you guys can just comment and we can.
I'll do that. I'll keep an eye over the next day or so on the comments under this, and if you have anything else, then I'll try and answer it as best I can. don't inundate me. I've only got so much time, but
It's not like you're going anywhere or anything. So
that's also true.
You know.
That's also true. Yeah. But anyway, I hope that if there's nothing else, I hope you found that interesting. And do check out the rest of the stuff that we got from VOCES8 live at home. You can see it on our Facebook page. It'll be frequently on Instagram and YouTube and all that sort of stuff. So do check that out. I think this morning we put up a list of what's happening next week. So go and have a look at that. And if there's any sort of session that you find interesting, you can always find that on the relevant platform at 2 p.m. British Summer Time. And we'll see you all there, and hope you're all doing well in wherever you are. And I know it's a tough time for lots of people, but hopefully with this sort of thing, we can make each other smile a little bit through the day. So good luck, everyone, and see you next time.
See you guys. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.